Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on Why Does Your Research Matter? Communicating Impact in Your Research Statement. My name is Allison Howard. I'm an Associate Director on the Graduate Student and Postdoc team at Penn Career Services, and I'm excited to chat with you today about how to make your research statement clear, compelling, impactful for the various search committees that you're going to be writing for. So the research statement is an interesting document because on the one hand, research is probably what you all have spent the bulk of your time doing. So in theory, your research is something that you know extremely well, right? You've spent a lot of time thinking about it. You spend a lot of time communicating about it in articles, conference presentations, what have you. And yet sometimes it's the very fact that you know your research so well that can be an impediment to communicating the broader stakes of your research to outside audiences, right? It's easy to get lost in the details or to assume that a connection is obvious when really it's only obvious to you. It's what they call the curse of knowledge. So one of my main goals for today is to help you kind of get out of your own head a little bit and into the reader's mind so that you can understand what they're looking for, how they're evaluating research statements, and how to tailor this document for different kinds of institutions and departments. So let's start with the basics. What is a research statement? It's a straightforward question, but already we run into a little bit of a hiccup because there are a variety of names for this document, which you might encounter in the course of your faculty job search. So sometimes they'll call it a research agenda, a research plan, statement of research interests or trajectory. Sometimes they'll put a specific page limit on it. Sometimes they'll ask for additional information like, please address how you plan to involve undergraduates in your research program or talk about your potential to supervise undergraduate research. So while in some cases these are just different names for the same thing, in other cases, one school may be asking for a slightly different document than another school. And if you look at this list, you'll notice that some of these descriptions are very future-oriented, so talk about your plans or goals, while others are more focused on the past, right? Describe your dissertation or past publications. So unfortunately, as is true of really all of the documents that you'll be producing for the academic job market, you can't really do a one-size-fits-all approach because they're all going to want something slightly different. But broadly speaking, in many cases, this is what a school means when they ask for a research statement. So it's a document that summarizes your past and present work and outlines future research directions. So you really want to hit on all three categories, past, present, and future, though not necessarily in equal measure, which we'll talk about more in a moment. Often the future research is the most important section. It's going to address not just what you're researching, but how and why. So it's not just about the topic of your research, but more broadly, what questions are you trying to answer? What are your methods? What have you found so far? What are the implications of those findings, right? This idea of implications is extremely important and sometimes a neglected piece of the research statement. It's going to highlight your publication and funding record as well as future publication and funding goals. So this serves as kind of external validation of your research, right? When it was deemed worthy of publication or funding. It's going to show that you have a concrete plan and are a serious scholar. And in particular, the more concrete and specific you can be about your research goals moving forward and how exactly you will achieve those goals. So how exactly you're going to fund your research, your timeline for publishing various papers, things like that, the more likely it is that search committees will believe that you can actually follow through on what you're proposing, right? It's easy to give sort of broad abstract goals of, okay, I'd like to turn my dissertation into a book. I'd like to study this topic. But the more specific you can be about what it's going to take to get there, that's going to reassure search committees that you actually have a plan and can follow through within a reasonable timeline. And then logistically, we're looking at a 2 to 3 page document, single spaced. There's going to be variations here depending on your discipline. I've seen them as short as 1 page, as long as 5 pages. So this is a case where you definitely want to be talking to faculty members in your particular discipline to see what the standard is. Broadly speaking, though, search committees have to read a lot of these documents, right? They might be reading 200, 300 research statements, in which case I promise you that they will appreciate concision, right? Anything that you can do to streamline this document and only focus on the most important ideas is going to be helpful because they may not have very much time to spend on each research statement. But the most important question that a research statement needs to answer is, why does your research matter, right? Hence the title of today's workshop. Now, the value of your research may be obvious to you. Hopefully you feel that it does have value, but you can't assume that that value will be obvious to all readers. So as you're answering this question, here's some details that you want to try to provide. First, you want to think about context, right? You have to situate your research within your broader discipline. So what impact have you had or will you have on your field? And impact can mean a variety of things. So are you answering questions that have long gone unanswered in your field? Are you posing new questions that could help move the field in a new direction? Are you introducing new methods or using old methods in a new way? Are you bringing new attention to understudied topics? Regardless of your particular intervention, you just don't want to present your research in isolation. It needs to be in conversation with other scholars. So think about why your research might matter to those scholars in terms of how it intersects with their work. And in particular, think about how your research intersects with the work of the faculty members in the particular departments that you're applying to, right? Because that's your audience. You are writing to specific faculty members, specific schools. So how might your research intersect with theirs? Again, you want to think about, where have you published, who has funded your research, what awards have you won? Because this is basically external experts saying, yes, this research does matter, right? Anyone can say about themselves, my research matters, but if there's other people who can vouch for you, other experts in the field, that's going to lend more credibility to your research. So definitely incorporating that. And then finally, you want to think about what you will accomplish as a faculty member at that university, right? So it needs to be future oriented, because ultimately what they care about is the research that you will be doing at that institution if they hire you, right? The past research is done and over. So they're thinking about what are you going to accomplish once we hire you? And as much as possible, trying to tailor it again to that particular audience, thinking about the value you can bring to their department. So can you expand in some way on the research that their faculty members are already doing? Can you bring a new area of expertise to their department? Always trying to tailor as much as possible. Okay, so in terms of the features of a strong research statement, first off, it demonstrates the evolution of your research, right? So we said that it's going to cover past, present, and future research, but importantly, those three sections need to feel connected, right? You want this to feel like a cohesive narrative and kind of connect the dots so that the reader understands how one research project led to another, how you've grown as a researcher over time. Otherwise, it's not going to feel like you have an overarching research program. It's just going to feel like a random list of projects with no particular connection to each other. And I've seen this sometimes in research statements where it's like, first I did this project, then I did this project, then I did this project. That doesn't really help them understand the trajectory. So there needs to be connective tissue between those sections. A strong research statement is going to be laid out logically to demonstrate your ability to think about and communicate your research as a serious scholar. So they're evaluating not just your research, but your ability to communicate about that research. So it needs to be kind of well written because they're thinking already about the situations you may encounter in the future as a faculty member where you will have to defend or justify your research to various audiences. So you might have to convince deans or provosts or other senior administrators that your research matters. Certainly in grant writing, this is what you're doing. Even when working with students, you might have to convince them your research matters in order to recruit new majors into the department. So they are evaluating your communication skills as well. So you want to give some thought to that. A strong research statement shows your potential to pursue future research that is independent, innovative, and will meet tenure expectations at a particular institution. So independent, this is particularly important if your research currently is quite close to that of your advisor or PI. You need to make sure that you're finding ways to distinguish what you do from that advisor, make it clear that you're adding something new or innovative to the field. In terms of tenure expectations, so any of you who attended my workshop yesterday will have heard me talk about this a little bit already. It may seem odd to be thinking about tenure now when that's years down the line, but I've heard it firsthand from many faculty members that when they are reading applications, they are already thinking about tenure and is this person going to be tenurable in the next 5 to 7 years? So I actually found this great article on Inside Higher Ed, which is a good resource for information on the faculty job market. And this author actually defined the research statement as basically a text that outlines how you plan to get tenure, right? Search committees use this document to see how you are positioned to follow a particular research trajectory, which they will use to determine whether you are potentially tenurable or not. So again, it's really important that you be future oriented, that you think about the work that you're going to be doing at that institution, and that you go in knowing ahead of time what their tenure expectations are, which are going to be different for every school and department, so that to some degree you can match your future research aims to their expectations. Other features of a strong research statement, again, tailoring to the department or institution as much as possible, thinking about not just what are you going to get out of being hired as a faculty member, because I think that's pretty obvious, but how are you going to benefit them in terms of grants, collaborations, working with their students, and then also tailored to the audience of the search committee as much as possible. So in most cases, not everyone on the search committee is going to be a specialist in your particular subfield. There's going to be a range of kind of specializations represented there. So let's say you're a PhD student in linguistics. Maybe everybody on the search committee is a linguist, but you might have someone who does phonetics and someone who does sociolinguistics and someone who does computational linguistics, right? So they're not necessarily working in your particular area, which is why it's so important that you be very clear and explicit about, what you found, why that matters, kind of cutting through the jargon, because there is going to be, to a certain degree, an interdisciplinary audience represented on that search committee. Okay, so how exactly do you go about tailoring a research statement? So first, you need to understand the culture and priorities of the different institutions and departments that you'll be applying to, and more specifically, how they think about research, right? Because research is not just one thing. Different schools have different approaches and priorities when it comes to research. So you can find this information in a variety of places on the university website and the department's website, seeing what provosts and deans are saying about their research goals. And you want to pay attention to things like, do they emphasize undergraduate research? Are they interested in industry collaborations? Are those things that you can incorporate into your research statement? So if you look at Penn's website, you go to the main site, and they have this statement about Penn's research enterprise that says, Penn places a strong emphasis on encouraging and enabling any student to carry out research. So if I were applying for a job at Penn, I would probably find a way to talk about that in my research statement, my plans to encourage and enable students to carry out research, both undergraduates and graduate students, because that's obviously central to the mission statement at Penn. You also want to pay attention to the job ad and any pertinent information that may be there. So that's not just certain specializations they might be looking for, but making sure you understand which department the position is housed in, particularly if it's a joint appointment. Is this part of a cluster hire or new initiative, right? Having some context for what they're looking for. So I found a couple of examples to illustrate this. So University of Michigan College of Innovation and Technology is in the midst of a significant faculty hiring initiative seeking to fill 25 new positions across 3 divisions, right? So if I were applying to this position, I would want to know first, which of those 3 divisions would I be housed in? What are the expectations there? But also, what are the goals of this broader hiring initiative? So that when you're in your research statement, you're not just talking about your individual research goals, but how you would be able to help them advance their goals, participate in this initiative, and be kind of collaborative in that way. Then this position at Harvey Mudd, they talk about, there's significant opportunities for collaboration with colleagues at other undergraduate schools, and they list specific departments that they tend to collaborate with. So again, if I were applying for this job, I would be articulating very specific plans for collaboration with some of those departments. So not just saying abstractly or generally, yes, I'm interdisciplinary, yes, I'm open to collaboration, because that, is not very persuasive in and of itself, especially if 200 other people are saying the same thing, but saying, here's a specific idea that I think would really be a really good match for Africana studies. Here's an idea I have where I could collaborate with media studies, bringing as much specificity as possible. That's ultimately what tends to be more persuasive. Again, you want to look for a copy of the department's tenure guidelines, so you make sure you understand what they're going to be expecting down the line in the first 5 to 7 years as a faculty member. These are usually pretty easy to find online. So these are some tenure guidelines for the history department at University of Buffalo. Basically, it says to get tenure that you need 1 book published and significant progress toward a 2nd book. In case you aren't aware, for those of you who work in fields where it's common to publish a book, turning your dissertation into a book takes much longer than you might expect. I've heard this from lots of junior faculty members. So if I were applying for a position in this department, I would be very specific about, here's what needs to happen, 1, 2, 3, to get the disc publication ready. If you're adding new chapters, what's your anticipated timeline for that? If you've already been in conversation with any presses, definitely mention that, or talk about which presses you're going to be targeting, so that you're showing them that you actually understand what it's going to take to make this happen, and not just saying, yes, I plan to turn the dissertation into a book, but really thinking through the steps that are involved in that process. This is another example, the econ department at Swarthmore. So this is more of a teaching-focused institution, meaning they don't have as intensive of publication requirements, but they are still looking for an active research program that extends beyond the candidate's dissertation, right? So again, when you're writing your research statement, you want to already be thinking beyond the dissertation. And I sometimes see research statements that are really just a description of the dissertation. I understand if you're a PhD student and that's the only major research project you've ever worked on, it might seem like that's what you want to focus on. But by the time you start a faculty position next fall, the dissertation will be over, right? That part's done. They want to know what comes next. So always thinking beyond the dissertation, next steps. They also talk about how they value collaborative research and co-authored publications, including co-authorship with students. So that's something you could incorporate into the research statement and your future research plans to demonstrate alignment with this particular department. And the last step is just to review the CVs of faculty in that department to understand what their research profile looks like. Again, I talked about this a little bit in the workshop yesterday. It's not that you have to have exactly the same research profile as their current faculty members, the exact same number of publications, but it can give you a sense of what's most important to them, what they seem to be rewarding within that particular department, so you have a better sense of what you emphasize in your research statement. Okay, so let's talk about the structure of a research statement a little bit. Typically, it's going to have three distinct parts: past, present, and future research, right? We talked about this already. But in most cases, past and present research, those sections are going to be a little bit shorter, especially if you're in a STEM field, right? That's where you really want to put a lot of emphasis on those future research plans. If you're in the humanities or social sciences, the balance might be a little bit different, but you're still going to be talking about future research. So make sure that you're hitting on all three sections. You want to begin with a high-level summary to quickly answer important questions the search committee may have. So you're not going to dive straight into the dissertation or straight into your current postdoc research project. You need to give them some context first. And what you want to be doing is kind of defining yourself as a scholar broadly, positioning yourself within the field before you start describing specific projects. So, in my case, I might say something like, I work at the intersection of literature, history, and politics to trace the lingering legacy of fascism in post-World War II Europe, which is something that I did many years ago. So having one quick sentence that sort of sets up, here's who I am, here's what I work on, this is my scholarly identity. It should just be one sentence. If you can't communicate your scholarly identity in one sentence, that can be a problem. Like, they need to be able to evaluate very, very quickly, is this going to be a good for our department? Do I understand who they are and what they work on? Listing your main questions and methods, the themes that kind of unite all of your research projects. In terms of structure, section headers and subheadings can help visually organize the statement, making sure there's white space. You're not trying to cram too much information in there. The fact of the matter is, in many cases, search committees will be skimming these research statements, which I know might be disappointing to hear because you're going to spend a lot of time working on it and tailoring it. But at one of our faculty panels yesterday, several of the panelists shared that when they've been on search committees, they sometimes have 200 or 300 applications for a single position, which means they can only afford to spend a few minutes on these documents, right? So you want to make it as easy as possible for readers to pull out the main ideas. And that's where subheadings can be useful, right? They can quickly skim and understand what you're talking about without getting too granular. Figures and diagrams can be helpful, if you're in a STEM field, possibly social sciences. Just make sure it's actually adding value to the research statement. So don't add a figure just to have a figure, and make sure that they are clear, legible, intuitive, clear labels, clear caption. A reader should be able to immediately understand what they're supposed to take away from that figure. If you have tiny, tiny little captions that are really hard to read, that's not going to be that useful. And make sure you're not getting too granular with your findings, right? The research statement is meant to represent your overarching research program, not the specific findings of one specific article. So try not to get too in the weeds there. Okay, so if we think about this opening summary section a little bit more carefully, here's what that summary needs to accomplish. So it needs to be short and to the point. This is very important. Again, they only have a few minutes, so really just grabbing their attention right away. Have a hook to draw the reader in. And when I say have a hook, I don't mean like the kind of hook you might have used when you were writing your personal statement to get into grad school of like, ever since I was a child, I wanted to be a professor. No, not that kind of hook. But by hook, I mean telling them right away from the very beginning, this is why my research is interesting and exciting and relevant to your particular department, right? Always thinking about the audience that you're writing to. Again, you're going to begin with the broad context of your research. So what are you trying to do? Why is this important? And you really want to put the most important information first. So what I sometimes see is, the very last paragraph of a research statement has this beautiful summary and brings everything together and says, and this is why my research matters. You don't want to leave that to the very end, right? You don't want to keep them guessing. You don't want to force them to read that far to get to your conclusion. So basically, you want to flip the order around and almost put the conclusion first, put that most important information front and center, so that if all they read is that opening summary, they still have that clear articulation of your scholarly identity and why your research matters. Then you can briefly touch on past and current work. So the key questions you were asking, methods, results. Again, very briefly, this is still just the summary section. You're going to be going into more detail later on, but just giving them a kind of hint of what's to come. Mention unanswered questions that will inform your next steps, and then conclude with your future research aims and how you will move the field forward. So that opening summary almost serves as like an abstract of the broader research statement. So again, if that's all they read, which is possible, you need to make sure that they have all the information they need really in that summary. And then the rest of it is just going to add a little bit more detail to what you articulate at the beginning. In terms of the other sections, I'm going to move through this quickly just for the sake of time. I will share the slides afterwards with anyone who's interested. But for the past research section, again, this is typically the shortest section. As a general rule of thumb, the older a research project is, the less important it's going to be for the research statement, particularly if your future research aims aren't directly connected to it. But you can briefly talk about questions, methods, findings. The part I wanted to emphasize was making sure that you explain how this research inspired your next project. So again, always having those connections between sections, so it's not just a string of abstracts with no relationship between them, right? You want that cohesive narrative. So how did this past research inspire your current project? You know, even if the current project went in a totally different direction, you want to be able to contextualize that for your readers and help them understand why you might have changed fields or changed research directions. In terms of your current research, the key points I want to hit on is you want to make sure you identify key findings, even if the research is not yet complete. I know that can be tricky if you're still waiting on data, waiting on analysis, but if you're not able to articulate now why this research might be exciting or what the implications could be, then the search committee is not going to understand the value of what you're doing. So even if you're only partway through, you still have to find ways to communicate what you found so far or what you expect to find, always focusing on significance and implications for your field. And then in terms of future research, you know, we've already talked about a lot of this already, but making sure you identify both short-term and long-term goals. So sometimes people will only talk about what they plan to do maybe over the next year. Particularly in STEM fields, I think it's more persuasive if you can move that out a few years, right? And then talk about, here's what I plan to accomplish in year 1, year 2, year 3, possibly out to 5 years. Again, thinking about that kind of 10-year timeline that search committees are thinking about. But always ensuring that your plans are realistic, fundable, and publishable, especially at that institution. So make sure that whatever you're proposing actually matches the resources that they have. So one of our panelists yesterday, you know, she does research involving MRIs, and she was applying for some jobs at small liberal arts schools that don't necessarily have an MRI machine, right? So you have to think about that, and, you know, how are you going to get around that? How are you going to fund the acquisition of new resources if necessary? You know, talking about the funding that you plan to seek and being as specific as possible. So not just, you know, I will apply for NIH grants, but naming specific grants and why you think you'd be competitive for them. At this point, honestly, I'd be trying to think about funding sources outside of the NIH and NSF because of the recent funding cuts, or are there other funding opportunities that you might pursue? Potential collaborators, presses, or journals that you're targeting. Again, as much detail as you can bring as possible. It's going to persuade the search committees that you've actually thought through how to accomplish these goals, and they're not just kind of abstract pipe dreams. Okay, in terms of best practices for writing, number one, you want to try to avoid jargon, and that's not because the search committee won't understand the terms that you're using. I mean, these are very smart people who have PhDs in your discipline. It's more that if you use too much jargon, it tends to impede the clarity of the writing and the clarity of that, you know, why does my research matter response, right? Again, they're reading this quickly, they're skimming, so don't get too bogged down in jargon. Try to make simple, confident, declarative statements. I know some students and postdocs struggle a little bit with confidence with saying why their research matters because it feels like they're bragging or something. But if you don't have confidence in the value of your research, it's going to be really hard for search committees to have that confidence, right? So making sure that you're communicating that. We talked about utilizing headings and white space. Make sure that you're demonstrating your research independence. So be careful about when you're using we versus I if you do work in a collaborative field. Obviously, you want to acknowledge your collaborators. You're not going to pretend they don't exist. But remember, these search committees are not hiring your whole lab. They are just hiring you. So they need to understand what your specific contributions have been to these broader collaborative research projects. You can think about citing strategically. So it's pretty common to have some citations in a research statement. You can be citing yourself. That's an easy way to get your publications into the research statement in a natural way. You might cite major scholars in your field. Just be cautious of not oversighting. So this is not a journal article. It's not a lit review. They're not going to be impressed by the number of citations that you have. And in fact, too many citations can clutter up the message. They really just want to know about your research. So be selective about how you're citing. Definitely ask faculty and colleagues for feedback. A lot of the guidelines around research statements are going to be discipline specific, so you want to make sure it's matching expectations in your field. Although we at Career Services are happy to read research statements as well. And sometimes it's valuable to have someone outside of your field read it just to make sure that the ideas are coming through clearly for that kind of interdisciplinary audience of the search committee. Try to draft multiple versions for different types of institutions, ideally tailoring for every school. But if you feel like you don't have the bandwidth for that, at the very minimum, I would have a version for R1s, a version for SLACs, thinking about the different categories of institutions you might be applying to. And then this last one might seem obvious, but proofread, proofread, proofread. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen an otherwise very strong research statement have a glaring typo on the very first page. And I would like to think that that would not be the determining factor of whether or not someone gets hired. But again, if they have a stack of 200 applications and they are looking for ways to get through them quickly, that might be enough of a reason for them to say, never mind, this looks unprofessional, and move on to the next candidate. So proofread multiple times, have other people proofread the documents as well, because it can be difficult to see your own errors. So you just want to make sure you're presenting that professional profile. And then just a few concluding thoughts about AI, because obviously people are using AI for everything these days. I don't think there's necessarily a problem using AI to support the writing of these documents, but here's some things to keep in mind. Anything that you feed into AI probably will get used as training material. So you want to make sure that you're comfortable with that, right? Your research is your intellectual property, particularly if you're working on something sensitive. Do you want that to be fed into, ChatGPT or one of those other chatbots? And you just want to make sure that your voice is still coming through clearly and that the language feels sufficiently natural, specific, and tailored to your field. So in my experience, there can be a real flattening effect to the prose that ChatGPT produces. It tends to do a little bit better when you're writing for generalist audiences. As the audience gets more niche or specific, it struggles a little bit with that. So if you are using AI, you definitely want to be coming behind it and doing that editing to make sure that it is appropriately tailored to these audiences and represents your voice. But it can be useful for things like, some of that tailoring work, making sure that you're matching the language of the job ad. It can sometimes help with that. It can help with refining sentence level prose. So if you're being too wordy and you're trying to condense a section, sometimes it can offer support there. So just be kind of thoughtful about the way that you might be using AI tools, because if you just ask it to write these documents for you, you're going to end up with something that sounds very generic, in my experience. So these slides I'll skip for now. These are for you to use later on. And like I said, I'll share the slides with everyone, but we have some brainstorming questions and some prompts to help you get started on your research statement or edit your research statement if you already have a draft. So you can use these later on. And then we have lots of resources on our website that can support you as well. So we have a detailed guide to research statements and all of the other documents that you'll have to produce. We also link to additional resources that can be helpful. We have this whole Preparing for the Academic Job Market Guide, which you can access through our website. You all have access to something called the PhD Career Training Platform, which is an external vendor that we partner with. They have a whole video on how to write a research statement. They are also hosting their own academic job market bootcamp later in August. So if you just can't get enough of research statements, if you just want to hear more, feel free to attend their workshop on research statements on August 19th, just to get a different perspective on these documents. And don't forget about the upcoming programs in our prep camp. So later today, we'll be talking about CVs and applying for postdocs. And then next week, we will pivot to talking about careers beyond academia, if that's interesting to you. Definitely schedule a one-on-one advising appointment with us to get your documents reviewed. Again, we'd be happy to look at your research statement or anything else. Those appointments are starting to fill up quickly. So if you have a deadline coming up soon and you want to make sure you get feedback before then, I encourage you to schedule sooner rather than later.